Have you ever watched men in expensive suits sell off your youth, laughing like you are a washed-up relic? They shoved me from the company I built, tossed me a puppet title, and called my 1% stake a worthless souvenir. But they forgot the crucial clause I planted 12 years ago. That despised scrap of paper is actually a nuclear button. Today, I will show them what the elite sky looks like when it collapses. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. Recently, YouTube completely disabled our monetization features, leaving our team with absolutely no budget to keep this channel operating. If you find today's story compelling and wish to help us survive, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community, where you will gain access to exclusive and true stories that are significantly longer, packed with intricate situations we simply cannot publicize on YouTube, and brought to life by multiple emotional voice actors in a single narrative. You can easily join us by scanning the Patreon QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by clicking the link provided in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's journey. My name is Olivia Cooper, and I'm about to tell you how I burned an empire to the ground. I am 38 years old, serving as the chief engineer and the sole architect who painstakingly wrote every single line of the core codebase that powers the microbiological irrigation systems at Arrow Yield Solutions, located right here in Denver, Colorado. My work is the beating heart of this entire operation. Yet, if you looked at me standing silently in the corner of our hyper-modern, glass-walled executive boardroom this morning, you would think I was a ghost lingering where I did not belong. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the suffocating arrogance of men who only know how to harvest what others have planted. At the head of the massive oak table stood Marcus Thorne. Marcus was not a builder. He was a corporate parasite, a slick chief executive officer planted by our venture capital overlords to dress the company up for a quick slaughter. He was currently pacing back and forth, passionately delivering a flawless, high-energy presentation about a pending $250 million merger with Vanguard Agronomics. Vanguard was a massive, soulless agrochemical conglomerate known globally for burying green technology to protect their toxic chemical monopolies. I stood entirely ignored in the cold shadow of the projected slides. Marcus gestured expansively, his custom-tailored suit catching the ambient light as he pointed to the equity distribution chart on the screen. He paused dramatically, letting a condescending smirk stretch across his face before he deliberately pointed his laser pointer at my tiny slice of the pie. And of course, we have reserved this little 1% sliver as some spare change to thank the old guard, Marcus announced, his voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. The entire room erupted into synchronized, sycophantic laughter. My eyes scanned the faces of the executives, finally landing on Julian. Julian was a young vice president of operations. Just a few years ago, he was a stumbling intern whom I personally trained. I spent countless evenings staying late to help him understand the very technology he was now so eagerly selling out. Now, he was throwing his head back, laughing the loudest at the expense of the woman who practically built his entire career. It was a perfect, sickening microcosm of toxic corporate culture, a cheap imitation of Silicon Valley ruthlessness minus the actual genius. As the presentation continued, a cold realization settled deeply into my bones. I watched the restructuring slides click by one after another. My name was nowhere to be found. The organizational charts leaped straight from Marcus to Julian, completely bypassing the engineering department altogether. 12 years of my life, 12 years of sleeping on a cot in the basement laboratory, 12 years of breathing life into a complex machine learning algorithm that could save dying soil, was being casually treated as obsolete scrap metal. Marcus was selling my life's work, and he was actively erasing my existence from the company history to make the transition look completely seamless to the corporate buyers. I did not scream. I did not throw my coffee at the screen. I just stood there and watched them gloat, absorbing every single ounce of their toxic jubilation. I let the coldness harden my resolve. The final blow arrived just a few hours later, at exactly 3 in the afternoon, while I was sitting at my desk trying to compile a final status report for my loyal team. An automated email popped onto my screen. It was a formal notice of immediate transfer. I was being reassigned to the role of corporate culture advisor. It was a ghost title, a meaningless combination of buzzwords designed to humiliate me and push me out the door. The role came with absolutely no executive power, 0 direct reports, and a budget of $0. They were shoving me into a metaphorical broom closet to keep me quiet until the ink dried on their massive payout. I immediately reached for my mouse to pull up the core server architecture, intending to secure my personal development logs. A bright red error message flashed aggressively across my monitor. Access denied. My administrative privileges, the master keys to the digital kingdom I had coded entirely from scratch, had been revoked without a single word of warning. They had cut me off completely. In the span of a single afternoon, I had been systematically eradicated from my own brainchild right before the closing date of the biggest deal in the history of the company. Marcus and his board of vultures truly believed they had successfully neutered me. They thought I was just a tired, middle-aged woman who would quietly accept a meaningless title and fade away into obscurity while they popped champagne over their $250 million payday. They thought my 1% was just a pathetic rounding error. They were completely wrong. The new office they assigned me was located in the second sub-basement, positioned conveniently between the humming boiler room and a supply closet smelling strongly of industrial bleach. The fluorescent light above my desk flickered constantly, casting a sickening pale glow over the empty walls. This was my prison. They expected me to pace this concrete cell, pull my hair out, and drown in desperate rage. Instead, I sank into a profound and deadly silence. I sat perfectly still in the squeaking chair, staring at the blank monitor. Anger is a loud and messy emotion that leads to careless mistakes. Cold execution requires absolute stillness. I knew something the brilliant venture capitalists upstairs did not. Marcus Thorne was a creature of the modern digital age. He liked neat bullet points, brief executive summaries, and colorful dashboards. He was profoundly and fatally lazy when it came to reading the dusty, boring legal texts of the past. As soon as the clock struck 5 in the evening, I grabbed my coat and slipped out through the rear loading dock. I drove my old sedan through the driving rain toward the desolate industrial outskirts of Denver. My destination was a climate-controlled storage facility sitting completely isolated off an abandoned access road. This was the corporate graveyard, the physical archive where all the foundational paperwork from the earliest days of the company had been unceremoniously dumped and forgotten when we moved to the sleek downtown glass tower. The air inside my designated unit was thick with the suffocating smell of degrading cardboard and dry dust. I clicked on a heavy-duty flashlight, letting the strong beam cut through the absolute darkness. Towering stacks of banker boxes loomed over me like silent sentinels. I began tearing through them, coughing as decades of undisturbed dirt plumed into the air. I ignored the boxes from the recent years of rapid expansion. I needed the pure genesis. I dug deep into the bottom row, pulling out a battered crate labeled with a black marker indicating the year 2014. My fingers traced over the manila folders until they snagged on a remarkably thick, bound document. It was the original draft of the founding agreement. I did not want the sanitized digital copy sitting on the current corporate servers, but the raw and unedited paper contract. Without wasting a single second, I sped back toward the city center, pulling up to a brutalist brick building housing the law office of Elias Vance. Elias was a rugged and cynical commercial attorney who looked like he had survived 1,000 corporate wars. Years ago, when I was just a broke and sleep-deprived engineer running on instant ramen and impossible dreams, Elias was the only lawyer willing to draft my founder agreement for a fraction of his usual exorbitant fee. I threw the heavy folder onto his cluttered desk, sending a rogue stack of sticky notes flying across the room. Elias looked up over his reading glasses, his deep-set eyes narrowing as he instantly recognized the weathered document. "I need you to verify something for me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but laced with pure steel. Elias slowly opened the heavy cover. We both leaned over the yellowing pages. our eyes tracking down the dense legal jargon until we reached Section 4. More specifically, we focused entirely on Clause 4.b. I had insisted on adding this specific provision 12 years ago. Terrified that the greedy investors I was forced to court might one day try to steal my creation. It was a poison pill, buried so deep under archaic legal formatting that no modern auditor rushing a due diligence check would ever flag it. The clause clearly stated that my 1% equity was inextricably linked to the voting control over the core intellectual property. My 1% was not a standard financial share. It was a master lock. Absolutely no outright sale or transfer of the primary microbiological patents could be executed without my explicit and handwritten consent. Elias ran a thick finger under the text, a slow and predatory grin spreading across his wrinkled face. "Olivia," Elias murmured, tapping the page firmly, "this is not just a veto. Look at the trigger condition right below it. If the board attempts to force a merger or hostile takeover of the technology without your verified signature, the proprietary lock instantly breaks. It is a dead man switch." I nodded, feeling a massive surge of adrenaline replace the exhaustion in my veins. "Tell me exactly what happens to the code." "Elias." "If Marcus forces this deal," Elias explained, his voice vibrating with absolute disbelief and awe, "the moment the ink dries on the acquisition papers, every single line of your source code, every proprietary algorithm, everything making this company valuable, automatically reverts to an open source license. It becomes completely free and public for the entire world to download and use." The implications hung heavily in the stale air of his office. Vanguard Agronomics was paying a massive fortune to acquire a monopoly, a weapon to kill their green competitors. If they bought us, and the code went open source, their exclusive prize would become public property. The $250 million valuation of the merger would instantaneously plummet to absolute $0. "Should we send them a formal legal notice?" Elias asked, reaching for his yellow notepad. "We can stop the merger right now tonight." "No," I replied instantly, staring into the dark street outside his window. "We do not breathe a single word of this to anyone. If we warn them now, Marcus will just find a legal loophole to drag me into court for years until I'm completely bankrupt. I want him to feel invincible." Elias sat back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "You want to let him sign the paper?" "I want to let him climb," I corrected him, my tone dropping to a freezing register. "I want Marcus to stand at the absolute peak of his own arrogance. I want him holding the giant novelty check, surrounded by flashing cameras, completely certain that he has won everything. That is when we cut his safety rope. We just wait." We forged our silent pact right there in the dim light. I was no longer a victim trapped in a basement. I was a ghost walking their halls, holding the detonator to a bomb they did not even know they were sitting on. The following Monday morning, I walked through the sliding glass doors of the main lobby wearing a perfectly pressed beige cardigan and a smile so convincingly defeated it could have won an award. I was no longer the brilliant architect of their technological future. I was the obedient corporate drone gracefully accepting her forced pasture. I carried a small cardboard box containing a single potted succulent, a framed photograph of my dog, and a ceramic coffee mug, making a highly visible procession down to my new concrete cell in the second sub-basement. To complete the illusion of my total submission, I spent my first few hours drafting ridiculously cheerful emails about upcoming team-building exercises and sending out mandatory surveys about break room snacks under my hollow title of Corporate Culture Advisor. I made absolutely sure that every single keystroke screamed of a woman who had completely surrendered to her unfortunate fate. The arrogant wolves upstairs needed to see a broken sheep, so I deliberately gave them the most docile creature imaginable. My entirely useless new role provided the unquestionable excuse to wander the corporate halls unnoticed. I claimed I needed to observe cross-departmental communication to properly assess employee morale, which granted me a silent seat in the back corner of the daily transition briefings. I would sit quietly with a generic yellow legal pad, nodding enthusiastically while the executives ruthlessly tore my legacy apart piece by piece. Julian was the absolute star of these miserable meetings. The overwhelming arrogance radiating from his expensive designer cologne was genuinely nauseating. Whenever the conversation drifted toward the operational mechanics of the irrigation algorithm, Julian would aggressively take the floor. He would lock his eyes on me, puff out his chest, and proceed to loudly explain the very technical frameworks I had painstakingly invented in my own laboratory. "You see, Olivia," Julian said during one particularly painful Tuesday afternoon meeting, leaning across the massive boardroom table, "the dynamic fluid routing matrix is highly complex. It relies on real-time soil data, something we have to completely optimize and simplify for the Vanguard integration." He was mangling the fundamental concept entirely. He was trying to explain my own intricate neural network architecture to me, like I was a confused tourist asking for simple street directions. I pressed my fingernails so hard into my palms under the table that they almost drew blood, doing everything in my power to keep my face perfectly composed. "Thank you so much for clarifying that, Julian," I replied smoothly, my voice dripping with artificial gratitude and naive wonder. "You have such a wonderful, comprehensive grasp on the underlying systems." He beamed with profound pride, completely unaware that he was standing directly on a trapdoor I had meticulously built. Their absolute, blinding contempt for me quickly became my greatest tactical advantage, because they viewed me as an invisible, incompetent relic of the past. They became incredibly sloppy with their secrets. After the executives rushed out of the glass boardroom to grab their premium catered lunches, they routinely left highly sensitive, unredacted materials scattered haphazardly across the mahogany table. I would linger behind, pretending to diligently gather the discarded coffee cups, while my eyes rapidly scanned the confidential due diligence reports Vanguard Agronomics had submitted to our financial team. I began piecing together torn printouts from the trash bins and memorizing figures hastily scribbled on the whiteboards before wiping them clean. It did not take long for the numbers to reveal a terrifying, undeniably ugly truth. I noticed a massive, glaring discrepancy in the operational forecast Vanguard had provided. They were not allocating a single dollar toward manufacturing our sensor arrays or expanding our biological testing facilities. They were systematically zeroing out the entire research and development budget for the next 10 years. A freezing cold wave of horror washed over my entire body as the reality clicked into place. This was not a strategic acquisition to modernize their portfolio. Vanguard was not buying my life-saving green technology to use it. They were buying it to completely kill it. Our organic, low-chemical irrigation system was a direct, lethal threat to their highly toxic, synthetic fertilizer monopoly. They were willing to spend $250 million simply to bury my invention deep inside their corporate vault, ensuring the world would continue poisoning the earth with their hazardous chemical products. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their overarching strategy was breathtaking, but what I uncovered next was the definitive nail in their legal coffin. Tucked beneath a stack of greasy catered lunch receipts was a preliminary draft of a supplementary financial annex. It detailed a highly discreet, highly illegal personal payout. If Marcus successfully navigated the board approvals and finalized the complete suppression of our technology without triggering any federal antitrust alarms, Vanguard was going to reward him handsomely for his betrayal. There was a direct transfer order routing exactly $15 million into an untraceable offshore account under a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. They cleverly labeled it a post-acquisition integration consulting fee. It was pure, unadulterated blood money. Marcus was being paid an exorbitant bribe to quietly assassinate the company he was specifically hired to lead. My blood boiled with a violent, consuming heat that threatened to break my carefully constructed facade. The primal urge to storm directly into his luxurious corner office and rip the smug expression right off his face was almost overpowering. But I slowly closed my eyes, took a long, deep breath, and let the white-hot rage solidify into pure, calculated ice. I smiled to myself in the empty room. It was a genuine, terrifying smile. I carefully slipped the damning financial drafts into my leather portfolio. Over the next few agonizing days, I systematically digitized every single shred of this dark financial evidence. I compiled the undeniable proof of the catch and kill strategy alongside the documented $15 million bribe, locking it all securely away into a heavily encrypted, military-grade portable hard drive that I kept hidden at the absolute bottom of my purse. The ravenous wolves thought they were circling a defenseless carcass. They had absolutely no idea the prey was busy building an inescapable slaughterhouse just for them. The digital clock on my wall indicated there were exactly 48 hours left before the ink would permanently dry on the merger agreement. The heavy, oppressive silence of my sub-basement office was abruptly shattered by the sharp ringing of my desk phone. It was the executive assistant calling from the penthouse suite, coldly instructing me to report to the chief executive office immediately. I smoothed out the non-threatening beige cardigan I had chosen for the day, adjusted my glasses to look slightly askew, and began the long elevator ride up to the top floor. The physical ascension from the concrete depths of the building to the sunlit, glass-enclosed peak was a stark reminder of the corporate hierarchy they had violently shoved me down. Marcus Thorne was waiting for me behind his massive, imported mahogany desk. The panoramic windows behind him framed the sprawling Denver skyline, casting him in the silhouette of an undisputed king surveying his conquered territory. He did not bother to offer me a seat. Instead, he simply pushed a thick, neatly bound stack of legal documents across the polished wood surface. The title page bore the unmistakable, sterile formatting of a comprehensive severance package. "Let us cut the sentimental nonsense, Olivia," Marcus said, his voice laced with absolute disdain. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, steepling his perfectly manicured fingers. "We are finalizing the Vanguard transition this Friday. The new ownership structure has no room for legacy dead weight, especially not someone occupying a fabricated culture advisor role. I am offering you a clean exit. The package on the table includes a severance payout of exactly $1 million. He paused, letting the enormous sum of money hang in the air. Fully expecting me to gasp in profound gratitude, when I maintained my carefully practiced expression of confused distress, he aggressively tapped the secondary document underneath the severance agreement. "There is, of course, a mandatory condition," Marcus continued, his tone dropping into a threatening register. "That second document is a master non-disclosure agreement. It legally gags you from ever discussing the core intellectual property, the algorithms, or the structural history of this company. You sign both papers right now. You take the $1 million, and you walk away quietly into your retirement. If you refuse, or if you try to make any noise during the transition, I will unleash our entire corporate legal department on you. We will publicly smear you. We will claim you attempted to steal proprietary code, tie you up in devastating litigation for the next decade, and ultimately fire you with absolutely nothing but a mountain of legal debt." It was a brutal, textbook extortion tactic. He was holding a gun to the head of my career, demanding I sell the soul of my life's work for a bribe disguised as a severance check. The sheer audacity of his threat demanded a violent reaction. But I knew the script I had to follow. I needed to feed his monumental ego. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let my shoulders slump heavily, shrinking myself down into the posture of a completely broken, terrified, middle-aged woman who had just realized she was utterly powerless. I slowly reached out, letting my hand tremble violently as my fingers hovered over the sleek metal pen resting beside the documents. "Marcus, please," I whispered, injecting a pathetic quaver into my voice. "This is my entire life. I just need a moment to understand all of this legalese. The $1 million is generous, but the non-disclosure terms are so dense. Can I please just have 24 hours to let my family lawyer read over the minor clauses? I swear I will not cause any trouble. I just do not want to sign something I do not completely understand and lose my pension." Marcus stared at me with eyes full of undisguised pity and supreme contempt. I was performing the role of the defeated subordinate so perfectly that he swallowed the bait without a single second of hesitation. To him, My pathetic plea for a minor delay was the ultimate confirmation of his total victory. A brilliant, dangerous engineer would have fought back. A broken woman asks for her family lawyer to check the pension clauses. Fine, Marcus scoffed, waving his hand dismissively as if swatting away an annoying insect. You have exactly 24 hours. Olivia, bring the signed documents directly to the boardroom on Friday morning before the signing ceremony begins. I will instruct building security to leave your access card active for one more night so you can pack up the rest of the miserable garbage in your basement office. Do not make me regret my generosity. I nodded meekly, clutching the heavy documents to my chest like a shield, and scurried out of his office with my head bowed in total submission. The moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, the trembling in my hands stopped instantly. My posture straightened. The pathetic facade evaporated into the cold, recycled air of the executive hallway. He had just given me exactly what I needed. That night, long after the final janitorial shift had cleared out and the corporate campus fell into a deep, silent slumber, I returned to the building. The single swipe of my still valid access card echoed loudly in the empty lobby. I bypassed my basement office entirely and headed straight for the primary physical server room on the 4th floor. The massive steel door unlocked with a satisfying heavy clank. The room was freezing, filled with the deafening hum of cooling fans and the endless blinking of green and blue lights from the towering server racks. This was the true brain of the company, the digital fortress where my 12 years of labor lived. I connected my heavily encrypted laptop directly to the master terminal. My fingers flew across the keyboard with rapid, flawless precision. I was not there to steal anything or to destroy the databases. I was there to plant the seed of their destruction. I meticulously uploaded a highly sophisticated, deeply hidden countdown script. It was a digital tripwire intertwined intricately with the very foundation of the core codebase. I programmed the executable file to remain completely dormant, utterly undetectable to any standard security sweep. It had only one specific trigger. The moment the corporate ownership title was electronically transferred to Vanguard Agronomics without my verified encryption key, the script would violently awaken. I watched the progress bar hit 100%. The terminal flashed a bright green confirmation message. I cleanly disconnected my laptop, erased all traces of my physical entry from the security logs, and slipped out of the freezing room. Every single piece was now perfectly in place. The cheese had been placed on the trigger. The heavy metal spring was pulled back to its maximum tension. The deadliest mousetrap ever built in the history of this city was primed and ready, waiting patiently in the dark for the most arrogant rat to finally take the bite. Friday morning arrived with the kind of blinding, artificial brightness that only existed at the absolute top of the corporate food chain. The penthouse boardroom had been entirely transformed overnight. It no longer looked like a functional place of business, but rather a theatrical stage designed specifically for the coronation of greedy kings. Elaborate, towering arrangements of imported white lilies and rare orchids were positioned meticulously along the edges of the room, desperately attempting to mask the sterile, ruthless scent of corporate ambition with the heavy, sweet perfume of fresh flowers. At the far end of the expansive room, silver ice buckets sweated perfectly chilled, ridiculously expensive champagne, waiting patiently to be popped the second the final signature was secured. The executive leadership team from Vanguard Agronomics filed into the room exactly on schedule. They moved as a single, intimidating pack, their faces painted with the supreme arrogance of conquering warlords arriving to collect their hard-won spoils. Their bespoke charcoal suits seemed to absorb the morning sunlight pouring through the panoramic windows. They shook hands with exaggerated enthusiasm, clapping each other on the back with booming laughter, completely oblivious to the digital explosive device resting silently beneath their polished leather shoes. I slipped through the heavy glass doors just before they swung shut. Gone was the submissive, beige cardigan of the defeated corporate culture advisor. Today, I was wearing a sharply tailored, perfectly pressed black suit. It was a quiet morning dress for the empire I was about to publicly execute. I did not announce my presence. I glided silently along the perimeter of the room and carefully folded myself into a small, inconspicuous chair pushed tightly into the furthest corner. I became a harmless shadow, a ghost blending directly into the expensive mahogany paneling of the walls. Marcus Thorne caught my movement out of the corner of his eye. For a brief, terrifying second, a flash of genuine annoyance tightened his jaw. He quickly masked it with a wide, predatory smirk. He gave me a barely perceptible nod, his eyes flicking downward toward the black leather portfolio resting on my lap. In his mind, the narrative was already perfectly solidified. He was absolutely certain I was sitting there clutching the signed non-disclosure agreement, waiting obediently to exchange my permanent silence for my $1 million severance check. He turned his broad back to me, dismissing me entirely from his reality. The professional photographers hired to document the press release began circling the massive glass table like hungry vultures. The rhythmic clicking and bright flashes of their camera lenses created a suffocating, almost strobe-like atmosphere that made the room feel incredibly claustrophobic. The chief legal representatives from both corporations took their designated seats directly across from one another. They began the tedious, ceremonial ritual of physically turning every single page of the colossal, leather-bound merger agreement. Their voices were smooth, oily, and laced with overwhelming self-satisfaction as they verbally confirmed the dense legal clauses. It was a sickening symphony of corporate jargon, a polite, highly choreographed dance masking a brutal assassination of my life's work. Then, it was time for the obligatory executive address. Julian stood up, buttoning his tailored jacket with a practiced, arrogant flick of his wrist. He looked directly into the flashing cameras and began to deliver his meticulously prepared speech regarding the brilliant future of the agricultural industry. It was a masterpiece of absolute, unadulterated fiction. He spoke passionately about sustainable ecosystems, about leveraging our groundbreaking microbiological technology to feed a starving world, and about the deep, unwavering commitment Vanguard Agronomics had to green, clean innovation. Every single word tumbling out of his smiling mouth was a calculated, filthy lie. He was waxing poetic about environmental salvation while holding the shovel they planned to use to bury my life-saving algorithms forever. The sheer magnitude of their hypocrisy was physically suffocating. The air in the room felt impossibly thick, pressing down on my chest like a massive lead weight. I kept my face frozen in an expression of polite neutrality, my hands folded neatly in my lap. But beneath my black suit, my heart was hammering a slow, deafening war drum. The ornate grandfather clock standing against the far wall began to chime. It was exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. The room suddenly grew incredibly quiet, the casual, arrogant chatter instantly evaporating as the overwhelming gravity of the $250 million transaction settled heavily over the executives. The Vanguard chief executive officer smiled warmly and slid the final, pristine white signature page across the smooth glass surface toward Marcus. Next to the document, he placed a heavy, solid gold Mont Blanc fountain pen. It was the ceremonial weapon chosen for the final, fatal execution. Marcus slowly picked up the pen. He let the cool, heavy metal rest in his hand for a long moment, soaking in the absolute peak of his own manufactured glory. He looked around the room one last time, his chest puffed out, making sure every single camera lens was focused directly on his triumphant face. He uncapped the Mont Blanc with a soft, satisfying click that echoed loudly in the silent room. He leaned forward, resting his left hand firmly on the table, and deliberately lowered his right hand toward the paper. The gold nib of the pen hovered mere millimeters above the dotted signature line. The champagne bottle sat chilling in the ice. The entire room held its collective breath in eager anticipation. Just as the black ink was about to permanently stain the paper, the heavy oak double doors of the boardroom were violently shoved open. The thick wood slammed brutally against the wall stops with a thunderous, echoing crash that instantly shattered the pristine silence of the corporate cathedral. Everyone jumped in shock, the cameras swiveling wildly toward the sudden, violent intrusion. Standing squarely in the doorway, completely ignoring the stunned gasps of the billionaire executives, was my attorney, Elias Vance. He did not wear a bespoke suit, and he did not carry a polite, deferential demeanor. He marched straight toward the center of the room with the heavy, uncompromising steps of a seasoned executioner. Before the building's security guards could even begin to react, Elias raised a thick, incredibly dusty stack of yellowed, aged documents high in the air. With a fierce, calculated swing of his arm, he slammed the papers violently onto the exact center of the polished glass table. The massive impact rattled the empty champagne flutes and sent a small cloud of archival dust dancing directly into the bright morning sunlight. On the very top page, a bright red, undeniable legal seal glared up at the entire room like a bloody warning sign. "This entire transaction is legally void," Elias Vance's voice boomed, completely shattering the fragile silence of the pristine boardroom. He did not flinch as a dozen furious billionaires glared at him. Instead, he slammed a thick, calloused finger against the yellowed page he had just thrown onto the center of the glass table. "I am reading directly from the Founding Articles of Incorporation, specifically Section 4, Clause 4.b, the core intellectual property, including all proprietary microbiological patents, cannot be sold, transferred, or dissolved without the explicit notarized signature of the founding architect, Olivia Cooper." Marcus Thorne's face immediately drained of all color, transforming from a portrait of supreme arrogance into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He dropped the heavy gold Mont Blanc pen. It clattered loudly against the glass surface, the sound echoing sharply across the room. "That is absolutely ridiculous," Marcus screamed, his carefully crafted executive composure completely disintegrating in front of the flashing cameras. He pointed a shaking, desperate finger toward my dark corner. "She is nothing. She is a redundant employee holding exactly 1% of legacy garbage. She has absolutely zero voting power on this board." The chief legal counsel for Vanguard Agronomics did not wait for Marcus to finish his pathetic tantrum. He practically lunged across the wide table, aggressively snatching the dusty document from under Elias's hand. His eyes darted frantically across the dense legal text. The entire room watched in absolute horror as the high-powered corporate lawyer stopped reading, his face freezing into a portrait of absolute terror. He looked up at the Vanguard chief executive officer and slowly, silently nodded. Elias was telling the absolute truth. The collective heartbeat of the room seemed to stop entirely. The cameras ceased flashing as the hired photographers realized they were witnessing a corporate execution instead of a celebration. The silence that followed was so profound, it felt like a heavy physical weight crushing the breath out of the men sitting at the table. I slowly stood up from my chair in the far corner. I did not shrink away. I did not bow my head in fake submission as I had done for weeks. I walked deliberately toward the center of the room. My tailored black suit, cutting through the sea of panicked executives like a sharp blade. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy, military-grade encrypted hard drive, and tossed it onto the glass table. It landed right next to the massive, unsigned merger contract with a heavy thud. "That is not just 1%, I said, my voice cold, steady, and carrying across the massive room like a definitive death sentence. "That is the master lock, and this hard drive contains the exact reason why I am keeping it firmly shut." I turned my gaze directly toward the Vanguard leadership team. "Inside that drive is a meticulously documented trail of your internal financial communications. It proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that you have absolutely no intention of utilizing our green technology. You intend to bury it to protect your toxic synthetic chemical monopolies. Furthermore, it contains the routing numbers for a $15 million offshore bribe intended for Marcus Thorne, disguised as a post-acquisition integration consulting fee, paid out solely for his assistance in this corporate assassination." A collective gasp rippled through our board of directors. Julian, the arrogant vice president who had mocked my intelligence just days prior. turned a sickly shade of pale and looked as if he was going to physically vomit right onto his expensive leather shoes. "But do not worry about bringing in your massive legal teams to fight me for control," I continued, raising my voice over the rising tide of panicked whispers. I was now staring straight into Marcus's terrified eyes. "Because the trap is already sprung. Last night, I integrated a dead man switch directly into the master database. If Vanguard attempts to bypass my veto, if you try to use legal brute force to seize the patents, or if I do not input my personal cryptographic key every 24 hours, the system will execute an irreversible command. Within exactly 3 minutes, the entirety of the proprietary source code will be automatically emailed to 500 agricultural universities, open source repositories, and independent research institutes across the entire globe." The threat hit them like a physical shockwave. A completely open source technology meant absolutely zero monopoly for their massive conglomerate. It meant the $250 million valuation instantly evaporated into thin air. Vanguard would be paying a massive fortune for something the rest of the world would receive for entirely free. "You are bluffing," the Vanguard chief executive officer hissed, though his voice trembled uncontrollably under the crushing pressure. "Try me," I replied instantly, holding his gaze with the terrifying calm of a woman who had already secured her total victory. "Sign the paper. Watch your empire burn to the ground." The Vanguard executive stared at me for 5 agonizing seconds. He looked at the encrypted hard drive, then at the terrified Marcus, and finally down at the $250 million contract. With a sudden, explosive roar of pure rage, the Vanguard chief executive grabbed the pristine document and violently tore it right down the middle. He threw the shredded pieces into the air, turned sharply on his heel, and stormed out of the boardroom. His entire legal and executive team scrambled frantically behind him, instantly abandoning the merger and leaving Marcus completely isolated in the wreckage of his own greed. Marcus collapsed back into his luxurious leather chair, gripping his hair as he screamed in absolute, unfiltered despair. His massive offshore bribe was gone. His professional reputation was permanently destroyed. The historic payout was dead. In the eerie, ringing silence of the ruined room, as the shredded pieces of a $250 million contract drifted slowly onto the expensive carpet like corporate snow, I calmly buttoned my black vest. I walked over to the table, looked down at Marcus's shattered, sobbing form, and smiled a genuine, terrifying smile. I picked up the gold Mont Blanc pen he had dropped, gently tossed it right onto his lap, and turned my back. I walked out of the glass boardroom without looking back, leaving behind a smoldering empire that I had completely incinerated with just 1% of power. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in and listening to my story today. I would love to know, where in the world are you listening from right now? If you found today's story engaging and want to help our channel survive, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community. There, you can listen to our very best, exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily join us by scanning the Patreon QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by using the link provided in the description or the pinned comment section. Thank you again, and see you in the next story.